So you know that Apostolic Majesty, the channel Apostolic Majesty, he's great. His knowledge, his raw knowledge is vast, much more than mine. And as an added bonus, he speaks proper, not like what I do. I'm a big fan of his work. I think it's a great channel. And so I was delighted when he contacted me and said he'd seen my video about the Romanovs and asked me if I would be a guest on his channel to talk all about specifically Tsar Nicholas II. And of course I said, yes, please. And so here it is, my appearance as a guest on Apostolic Majesty's channel, and he does most of the heavy lifting, he does most of the talking on this. So if that sounds like something you might be interested in, stick around, check it out.
Hello and welcome to this episode on Nicholas II, the last Tsar of Russia. Very lucky to be joined by History Bro. How are you doing, sir?
I'm very good, thank you. Thanks for asking. Happy to be here. Are you all right this evening?
I'm doing fine, thank you, and wonderful to have you on to talk about this topic. I was introduced to your stance on this topic from it was Daughter of Albion's video quite a while back now, where she was discussing did the Romanovs deserve it? I think, in fairness, I'm going to take a much more benign attitude to the Romanovs and ask that rather sort of controversial question. But yes, without further ado, I'll just start off and introduce the topic, if that's all right. So obviously, Tsar Nicholas II is the last Tsar of Russia. He reigns from 1894 until 1917. Arguably, he inherits Russia at the peak of its power and prestige after the reign of Alexander III, and is eventually forced to deal with certain calamities involving a disastrous war with Russia, his own relationship with his son and the faith healer Rasputin due to his son's haemophilia, the revolutions of 1905, which were brought on by the disastrous effects of the Russo-Japanese War, and eventually World War I and his abdication, exile, and execution at the hands of the Bolsheviks. So without further ado, how I want to start this conversation is by discussing what it really means to be the Tsar of Russia and to try and qualify the Romanov dynasty. Do you have any introductory remarks you want to make about that, History Bro?
Oh, well, I mean, gosh, there's a lot you could say. I suppose just to give it, the broadest of overviews on the Romanovs, they ruled for 300 years. I think 304 years. It's just a few years before their final downfall and death. They celebrated the 300-year anniversary, didn't they, of the Romanov rule. So that gives it some perspective. I mean, not many monarchies in all of history, not many dynasties rather, last for 300 years. I mean, that's quite rare. I know your knowledge of across the entire sweep of at least of European history is really quite thorough. Can you think of many other dynasties that even come close? I mean, 300's a good innings, don't you think?
Yes. The Habsburg dynasty lasted longer than that. They lasted from, well, you can say they last from the 1270s all the way up until 1918. But as an imperial dynasty, they last from roughly about 450 years. I mean, in English history, it's quite difficult to qualify, whether we refer to the Plantagenets as a united dynasty or as a series of separate dynasties. If you look at the French royal house, you can say that the entire sort of scope of French history is just the continuation of one dynasty, i.e. the House of Capet, with three separate branches, being the original House of Capet, the House of Valois, and the House of Bourbon, ultimately. And I would actually argue that the preceding dynasty of Russia had a very good innings. It lasted for around 800 years, which was the House of Rurik. So within that grand scheme of things, the Romanov line doesn't seem too long-lived, but nevertheless, I'm putting it against this sort of broad sweep of European history, and 300 years of continuous rule is nevertheless a great achievement.
And I suppose we can also say, can't we, that well, do you agree with this, that it had been shaky for quite a long time before Tsar Nicholas II got anywhere near the throne? For generations, there'd been very serious unrest and all sorts of assassinations when you look back through the list of his sort of immediate predecessors.
Yes.
It speaks of troubled times, doesn't it?
Yes, absolutely. And the most obvious example of that, of course, is Alexander II. Alexander II being the grandfather of Nicholas II, who of course was assassinated by the Narodnya Volya, or the People's Will, in 1881. A bomb basically exploded and blew him apart, and he died in the Winter Palace surrounded by his family. And of course that, I think it's fair to say, had a rather traumatic effect on the course of the dynasty thereafter. In terms of general instability, I think that needs to be qualified somewhat. During the first half of the 19th century, especially under the reign of Nicholas I, Russia, of course, had a series of revolts, a revolt in Poland, serious peasant uprisings, but nothing that, apart from at the very beginning, the Decembrist uprising, nothing that looked like the dynasty would be toppled, as opposed to what happened in Europe, where we constantly see the overthrow of monarchy. And in Austria in particular, it looks like we have the possibility of an entire disintegration of the Empire of Austria. And of course, we have the agitation brought on by the unification movements of Italy and Germany. So by contrast, you can argue that Russia was actually relatively stable. And one of the sort of great periods of instability that, results in, the cascade of events which will lead up until Nicholas II, is Russia's first major military defeat in the 19th century, which is the military defeat in the Crimean War. Before the Crimean War, it looked as if Russia was the preeminent military land power in the world at that point, and yet it's defeated in its own soil by the amphibious expeditions of the French and the British after Nicholas II had tried to expand his influence into the Balkans. And this is seen as a history bro, I think I can hear a little bit of bleed through on my side. Yeah. Do you mind muting when I speak? I think that's a good way of
Okay, I can try that.
Wonderful. So yes, by the time we get to 1856, the empire has been defeated militarily, and as a result of the intervention of a very competent foreign minister, Gorbachev, Russia is saved from a humiliating peace treaty in the Crimean War. It loses very little in the way of territory. However, Russia has many, social problems. It's not just hunky-dory. I'm not trying to give that impression. Serfdom as an institution has been going on since the reign of Michael I, in terms of a vast institution encompassing tens of millions of souls. By 1861, there are 23 million serfs in Russia, and one of the social sort of reforms brought on by Alexander II, who posthumously is known as, or rather at the time he was known as, Alexander the Tsar Liberator, is this desire to abolish serfdom, so as to supposedly, nullify any attempt to abolish serfdom from below through revolution, and to try and modernize the Russian economy, so to speak, to allow more serfs to leave their communal lands, their strips, and move over to the cities and produce, the beginnings of a proletariat, or a petty bourgeoisie class, essentially, that will allow Russia to become comparatively modernized. One of the themes you see throughout Russian history is this to and fro between the Westernizer influence, you could say the legacy of Peter the Great. I'm going to bring Russia kicking and screaming into the modern world. I'm going to build this this palace on the Baltic Sea, the Peterhof, and I'm going to make it my window on the west. And on the other hand, you have the reaction to that. You have the Russophile, Slavophile, pro-Orthodox position wanting to take us back to an even earlier tradition, that of the 17th century, or even before, to that of Ivan the Terrible. And this is personified in the form of Nicholas I, the Tsar who lost the Crimean War, who adopts this mantra of orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality, i.e. I'm going to rule Russia in a traditional monarchical, you could almost say medieval vein, in comparison to the pro-Enlightenment, pro-Western policies of the previous era.
There's a lot there that's very interesting. When you talk about the Crimean War, you mean the first Crimean War in the 50s, right? In the 1850s?
Yes.
And so that's sort of relatively famous, that the French and British went there and sort of thwarted the Russians. But am I right in thinking, because I know a lot less about this, didn't in the 1870s the Russians go back into Crimea, and there was no political will on the side of the British and the French, so they were able to do what they were never able to do in the 1850s? Have I got that right?
You've got that partially right, yes. It's not the Crimea, but it's in the Ottoman Empire, yes. This is the Russo-Turkish War of the late 1870s, in which Alexander II, using this mantra which Nicholas I had of the protector of the Orthodox Christian Slavs, goes in to deal with the Bulgarian situation. Essentially, the Turks have begun unleashing irregular soldiers to deal with Slav uprisings in the Balkans, and these irregulars were called the Bazibazouks, and it gave the Russians a perfect casus belli to liberate, supposedly, the Balkan peoples who were under Ottoman rule at that time. And through there, we have the creation of the first independent state of Bulgaria. And at one point, it looked as if by 1877, that the Russians not only were going to, gain all the potential things they wanted from the first Crimean War, but they were going to gain an ally which expanded through the Treaty of San Stefano from Bessarabia, Russia, connecting them to the Adriatic Sea, and therefore opening up Russian influence in the Mediterranean. Of course, this leads to a massive diplomatic pushback in the form of the Congress of Berlin, by which the British under Disraeli essentially undo many of the gains made by the Russians under threat of war and basically collective security against the Russians. You have Austrian intervention, you have German arbitration, you have French arbitration, and this results in a much more diminished settlement. But ultimately, yes, Russia has severely weakened the Ottoman Empire and has established a Bulgarian state which is sympathetic to Russia, to say the least, especially at that time.
Fascinating stuff. I thought it was really interesting that I've always thought of the sort of late Tsarist Russia as extremely shaky, almost sort of living dead. Almost, it's but it's interesting that you characterised it as though in the sweep of sort of mid to late 19th century, it's actually not all that shaky. You could point to other big nations that are just as bad in many ways, or even coming into existence. The Germans and the Italians weren't unified until relatively late in the 19th century. So it is interesting to think that it's not necessarily sort of the weak man of Europe, for want of a better expression.
Oh no, definitely not. And this is, as I mentioned, under the reign of Alexander II, this is a great period of reform. So we have the implementation of a new sort of European-style judicial system mirroring that of France. We have the creation of the so-called Zemstvo, or the local governorships established throughout the empire, which have some form of democratic accountability, albeit not at a national level, unlike the Duma we see after 1906. The Jews are given more rights during this period. You have university reform, albeit all of these things are checkered by the various assassination attempts of government ministers. So, for example, the main sort of reforming minister at this time is Dmitry Tolstoy. But there is, of course, an assassination attempt in 1866, which pushes back quite a lot of the impetus for the liberal reforms. However, at the same time, you have this constant policy throughout the 19th century, which is that of so-called Russification, i.e. wanting to assimilate or undermine basically the national aspirations of all of the local peoples within the Russian Empire. So just for context, only about 50% of the population of the Russian Empire were ethnically Russian. Russia was absolutely vast. It included most of Eastern Europe. It included everything from Finland, Poland, to Georgia and Armenia in the south, to eventually under Alexander II, to include Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, etc., and of course expanding in the east all the way to Korea. And this is a vast multi-ethnic empire. Many of the Polish subjects of the empire, for example, had only been recently assimilated over the course of the preceding 100 years with the partitions of Poland. And from the 1830s until the 1860s, we see major sort of uprisings against Russian rule. And in response, every time the Russians, who have originally promised the Poles some form of autonomy, take away that autonomy and begin to limit the use of like domestic languages like Polish, like Lithuanian, like Belarusian, even ancient sort of languages which are very similar to Russian, like Ukrainian. And this is the response of the infamous Ukaz by Alexander II, by which he wants to eliminate the use of Ukrainian as essentially a language. So at the same time we have these westernizing reforms, we have this attempt to solidify a pro-Russian identity. And this, I think, is a good time to talk about Russian autocracy. The official title of the Tsar was emperor and autocrat of all the Russias. And this, goes back to the westernizing sort of reform of Peter the Great, who opted out of the traditional use of the Tsar, which basically just became a colloquialism after that point, and adopted the European title of emperor. But you also have the Byzantine title of autocrat. And essentially this indicates that the emperor does not feel bound or constrained by any other sort of authority, in this case referring to the rights of the peasants, the rights of the church, and the rights of the boyars. However, I think in terms of qualifying this needs to really be understood. When we're talking about autocracy, we're not talking about unlimited, untrammeled power in terms of like a complete tyranny. Because, I mean, for example, Alexander Herzen, who was one of the forerunners of Russian socialism, would basically refer to the Tsarist government as, or the Tsars as Genghis Khan with a telegraph, essentially. No, this wasn't true. The Russian regime felt constrained by essentially divine right on one hand, gives the monarch the impetus to rule unimpeded by any sort of earthly or secular institution. Yet on the other hand, the monarch has a duty to abide by his coronation oath, essentially, by which he has to be just to his people, and he has to serve as a role model of Christian kingship. Within Eastern Orthodoxy in particular as well, we don't have the distinct separation of the church and the state either. We have the system called symphonia, by which the emperor enforces both the secular law and enforces the religious law at the same time. So you have this attempt at accord between the religious establishment, in this case the Eastern Orthodox Church, and the general basically administration of government. And this had been brought even more under the Tsar after the Patriarchate was abolished in the reign of Peter the Great. And we have the creation of the Holy Synod, which is basically led by an imperial appointee known as the procurator. So all of these elements, I think, combine to create a very distinct, and you can say unique form of government, especially compared to Europe, which progressively throughout the 19th century, you see the rise of parliamentarianism. Parliamentarianism in Russia encroaches very, very slowly, even though I think it's important to say that many Russians were liberals in the Western mold, and Russia was sort of alight with Western ideas, even though there was a concerted attempt by the government to crack down on such ideas.
Again, very interesting. Got a lot there to unpack. I mean, we're dealing with many decades there, aren't we? The sweep of various things you've mentioned. Do you think it's fair to say, I said this in my video with EOA, do you think it's fair to say that different Tsars dealt with the question of serfdom differently? Some, well, obviously they dealt with it differently, but some seemed more authoritarian than others, and that it was sort of just the perennial question of, really, really important political question for Russia for generations before Nicholas, before his father or grandfather even. But his grandfather, the doomed Alexander II, is it fair to say, to characterize him as being really quite lenient, very lenient? Well, you said trying to do away really with serfdom as best he could.
Successfully doing away with serfdom.
Right. And do you think that it's a fair criticism that he might have done it too fast, too quickly, or for want of a better metaphor, that he'd sort of let the horses run out of control, he'd let go of the reins?
Yes, that's a famous quote, isn't it? That under Peter the Great, the reins of state are held firm, and under Alexander II, the reins have been let loose, and the horse and the carriage are charging out of control. Regarding this, obviously serfdom, you can say, it was almost a uniquely Romanov institution. Unlike in Western Europe, where serfdom has existed for hundreds of years. I mean, my own personal assessment is that you can trace the beginnings of serfdom back to the crisis of the 3rd century in the Roman Empire. Serfdom in Russia occurs much later, and it's very much a state-sanctioned institution from the 17th century onwards, from the reign of Mikhail I. And you mentioned the different policies of the various Tsars. Well, of course, Catherine the Great, one of the most famous of the Tsaristas, comes in and she attempts to abolish serfdom, but then realizes it would make more sense to ally with the nobility and actually sell off serfs to various generals and nobles as essentially prizes. People are basically, as abhorrent as that sounds, they are basically sold off as basically a form of political patronage. And this actually works, ironically, in the favor of Alexander II, because by the 1860s, you have a nobility which is heavily in debt. And many of them are abandoning, the use of their old estates. They're not fulfilling, you can say, this ancient medieval function of the landed gentry, basically, governing his own territory. They're coming in to live at the court at St. Petersburg. And as a result, they're accruing massive amounts of debt through, frivolous spending there. And as a result of that, many of the serfs actually were mortgaged to the government to pay for these extravagant lifestyles. So ironically, when Alexander II abolishes serfdom, there is this financial incentive for the nobles, essentially, because they've already basically mortgaged their serfs to the state. So the state is able to do this in the sense which chimes with the nobility at the time, which is also very conservative in the sense that the peasants basically have to pay the price for their own liberation, and this is called the so-called redemption payments. In many cases, these last for 50 years, and it's only under Stolypin, during the reign of Nicholas II, are these redemption payments, reformed, and there is an attempt to, you can say, create a more benevolent system of post-Russian serfdom. But at the same time, I mentioned that one of the incentives was to try and, increase urbanization, because Russia seldom was urbanized at that point. But there is this, you can say, traditional conception of Russian rulership in which the Tsar is allied with the derevnya, or the selo, the village, and the mer, essentially the old communities. These communities are officiated over by a starosta, or an elder, essentially. And then later, during the reign of Alexander III, you have the creation of the land captains, essentially, to try and have some sort of official oversight over these old communities. So it's very complicated, this relationship with serfdom. It continues, you can say, in some form or another after the formal abolition of serfdom, by wanting to wed this, you can say, this agricultural communal identity of what it means to be a Russian peasant with the traditional values of Russian autocracy, essentially. So on the one hand, you can say I actually don't believe that the abolition of serfdom was reckless in that sense. I believe it was actually very in keeping with the conservative mantras of Russia at the time. And it was essentially also a means of increasing state efficiency. So after the abolition of serfdom, you have the creation of universal conscription, essentially. You're abolishing ancient elements, essentially, where the landed can draw troops from their own state, their own levies. Essentially, now the state is in charge of raising troops to fight in any future wars. And of course, universal conscription is brought in just a couple of years before that war I mentioned with Turkey. So all of these things, you can say, actually accentuate the power of the state rather than undermine it. So really, the abolition of serfdom is not so simple as an act of pure emancipation. Albeit I've probably been a bit long-winded there in my assessment there.
No, it's very interesting, fascinating, really, because I feel like there's certain things in history where something may happen decades before sort of the main event. In this example, probably the main event is the assassination of that entire family, if you want to say that's sort of the main event. And the big, some of the main events that caused that to happen were decades and decades and decades before. It was sort of sown then. And I think that the question of serfdom and how it was dealt with by Nicholas's grandfather is just absolutely key. For example, to understand Maoist China, the Great Leap Forward is the main thing. You could argue, or to understand the Soviets, the Holodomor is one of the sort of key things. And I think the question of serfdom is huge. And would you call it ironic that Alexander II was assassinated, even though he is, well, almost certainly you would say, had been the greatest ally of the sort of common people of Russia, and that he still couldn't escape assassination? Maybe irony isn't really the right word, but how do you feel about that? Do you have a feeling on that?
I don't really believe it's a sense of irony, because inevitably, when you begin the slippery slope of reform, there is always, there are always proponents who are, demanding more reform. And as I mentioned, because the abolition of serfdom was fundamentally conservative in its character, we have the rise of these agrarian anarchist movements, such as the Narodniks, or the People's Friend, And of course, we had the emergence of terrorist groups such as the Narodnaya Volya, the People's Will. And as we, enter into the 18th century, 1870s, we see, for example, this is a European affair. Socialists played a prominent role in the revolutions of 1848. The proto-communists will establish a commune in France in 1871. So Europe is essentially, alight with all these political ideas. And I simply believe that as you're, liberalizing the universities, as you're trying to promote Western-style education, you're at the same time, letting in these ideas essentially. And there are people such as the Narodnaya Volya who believe the Tsarist regime, or the person of the Tsar, is the foundation for an entirely repressive system. So naturally, one has to remove that. And so I don't necessarily think it's ironic. I think it's almost like the natural consequence of these reforms, that as the Russian state becomes bigger, as all of these ideas are, permitted sway, essentially, you have, greater moments of radicalism. And of course, this leads to a considerable pushback in Russia, because that is very much the view of Konstantin Podonotsev, who was the procurator of the Holy Synod, and you can say is the great eminence behind the rise of Alexander III, because as we've mentioned, Alexander II is assassinated. He's blown up during the early life of Nicholas II, and Alexander III comes in and establishes this manifesto of unshakable autocracy, based on the imitation of the coronation oath of Ivan IV, or Ivan the Terrible, more popularly known, reviving aspects of orthodoxy, autocracy, nationality, dispensing with people like Dmitry Tolstoy, who had been, the indispensable advisor of Alexander II, and trying to roll back these, the powers given to the Zemstvo, or the new jury system, trying to undermine the system of university education, and again trying to advocate, from a theoretical basis, that these Western ideas need to be frozen. They're not applicable to Russia. They just end up essentially in anarchy. Russia under the Tsar are basically inseparable as two forces. Without the Tsar, Russia would disintegrate, and the Russian Tsar needs to be supported by all of these ancient institutions, namely, the church, the peasantry, etc. Even Russian identity and Russian culture all need to augment each other in order to prevent basically the collapse of this entire system of not just government, but society in general. So this also revolves around, increased persecution of the Jews, the Jewish pogroms, etc. And this is where we get to, Nicholas the second sort of entering as a character, because after 1881, he becomes Tsarevich. He becomes the heir to the throne. His father is just in his 30s when he takes over, so it's not expected that the Tsarevich will take over anytime soon. And of course, Alexander III dies in his mid-40s. But as a young man, he was basically considered a fop, essentially a playboy, compared to the rather sort of prim, proper, gentlemanly, and family orientated person which we received. You can say that the young Nicholas II was nothing like that. I mean, one of his most famous dalliances, of course, in his younger life, is with the premier danseuse of the St. Petersburg Ballet, Matilda Kashenskia. So again, this sort of contrasts this adolescent sort of playboyish personality. And again, his father, believed he was utterly irresponsible, completely unprepared to rule, essentially, and was waiting for him to grow up and become a man before he would start allowing him to participate more directly in the functions of the state. And of course, Alexander III believed he had a long time in which he could groom his son effectively to take over. However, in contrast to that, rather than me just saying that, you would expect, there was a great expectation at the time, especially under certain figures like the railway minister, Sergei Witte, that the Tsar would take over and he would be amenable to liberal reform, constitutional reform, like another Alexander II, so to speak. However, the minute he becomes Tsar, there is a petition sent to him by the Zemstvo, all of these little regional councils which I've mentioned, the so-called Tver address. And in that response to that address, Nicholas responds, I am going to hold on to the values of autocracy, unshakable autocracy, as stalwartly as my, dear and late father, essentially. So despite, you can say, the lack of seriousness of the young man, he inherits and is inculcated in this idea of Russian autocracy and this ancient you can say even sort of early modern or medieval conception of rulership, which is completely at odds with many of the westernizing reformers of the court. And so this I think betrays a fundamentally sort of paradoxical personality in that sense. Of course, we mentioned his mistress. Of course, during the same time he gets married to Alex of Hesse-Darmstadt. He'd married he sort of met Alex first. I think roughly 10 years before, in 1884, during the coming of age ceremony for Nicholas when he reached the age of 18. He stayed with the young Alex for a long time, and by 1894, when the issue of marriage comes up, he has set his sights on going and marrying the young German princess. And again, this has to be understood. This is a marriage of love. This wasn't an arranged marriage as we would construe it. His father was very frustrated at the fact that he wanted to marry Alex of Hesse-Darmstadt, partly because in 1894 we have the Russo-French alliance, and any sort of friendly overtures to Germany by a marriage alliance between Germany. Of course, the Kaiser was incredibly enthusiastic, and the Kaiser was a core component of this. Would seem to undermine that alliance, and ideally Alexander III would have preferred his son to marry a Russian noble. Of course, this didn't happen, and one aspect I'm sure you're familiar with of history, bro, is that Alex of Hesse-Darmstadt was a very devout Christian. Of course, she was brought up a Lutheran, and the reason she originally rejected the proposal of the young Tsarevich was because she wouldn't abjure her Lutheran faith and convert to Orthodoxy, which of course was a prerequisite essentially for becoming the a member of the Russian royal family, as her own sister had done when she married the Grand Duke Sergei, the uncle of Nicholas. But of course, the Kaiser supposedly intervenes. He convinces her of her duty essentially to marry to Russia, and she relents, and they marry. And right from the beginning, she of course is quite a storm in the sense that she and Nicholas are so determined to marry that they marry just after the funeral arrangements of Alexander III, who dies in 1894. And this is seen as in a rather superstitious country like Russia, this is seen as a bad omen for the beginning of the reign. The fact they're not observing the traditional period of mourning, whereby the Empress, Alex, would go back to Germany. She would wait a year or so, then come back after the appropriate period of mourning had taken place, and then she would get married. And these sort of moments of, you can say, bad luck, such as the coronation ceremony, I'll get to it here. But before I get onto that, I've been talking for quite a long time. History Bros, anything you want to say?
Yeah, no, there's a few things in there. It's great stuff. I really am learning a couple of things. I knew that she was not Orthodox, yet really quite devout Christian. I didn't know she was a Lutheran, though. So that's interesting. And of course, yeah, it's an actual legal requirement to be Orthodox if you're going to be the Queen of Russia. So that's very interesting. And the other thing I thought that was really quite interesting, which I was only really vaguely aware of, I didn't really realise to this extent, was how much of a playboy old Nicky was before he got married. I knew that he wasn't entirely chaste. I knew he'd had a few affairs, but I didn't realise he was quite that bad. I mean, I think the thing that popped into mind is the idea of Henry V was supposed to have been some sort of playboy before he became king, and then completely changed his ways once he became king. I think that's not actually all that true. That's just Shakespeare. But nonetheless, it is interesting to think, because people that know about Nicholas II is that one of the main characteristics of his character was that he was really quite devout, really quite religious, and really quite moralistic. And I knew that as a younger man, he'd sort of been away, seen the world a bit, and I was aware that he had one or two lovers. But I didn't realise that his father was particularly worried about it. I've not really heard that before. Maybe I've heard it, but hadn't really taken it to heart. That's quite interesting. But one other thing there that you said that I definitely know about, which is perhaps worth stressing slightly, is that his father's death sort of came out of the blue a bit, and he was only, 26? Nicholas was only about 26, and hadn't really been given any real sort of formal training or advice or anything. And so it seems when he ascends to the throne and he writes letters to his mother and other people and to Alex. Or I think he famously said to one of his brothers or cousins, I'm not ready. I'm absolutely not ready. This is. I don't know how to rule. I don't know even how I'm supposed to address the ministers and things. And I think that's quite important because, looking back through history, when a new monarch ascends, some sort of hit the ground running. They've already been waiting decades. They're chomping at the bit, and other times they're just a small child or a baby even. But with Nicholas, we've got, he's a full-grown man, 26. He's no child. But it does seem fair to say that he just wasn't ready, wasn't in the right mind space, or would never be in the right mind space, really. And that, who is it? Massey calls him just a child. Even when he's in his 40s and 50s, he's still sort of like a bit of a child in some ways. Do you think any of that rings true? Do you think it's fair to say that he was completely unprepared for that top job?
Well, I think this speaks to the paradoxical nature of his personality. On the one hand, like I said, he was incredibly aware and conscious of his prerogatives of a ruler, i.e. maintaining this form of rule which had been established by his father and by his great-grandfather, that of Nicholas I, his namesake. However, at the same time, what you say is completely correct, which is this idea that Nicholas didn't want to rule. He wasn't chomping at the bit to become Tsar. He was expecting his father to reign for decades, essentially, and it was very much the expectation of the previous Tsar, Alexander III, to groom his son, to take to the throne in 10, 20, 30 years' time, essentially. But when you look at everything that Tsar Nicholas essentially did, it's always sort of harkening back to this conception, how would my father essentially want to govern? And this is a time, again, where many of his advisors were pushing him in a more liberal direction. So I think in terms of this, this young man who never had any conception, wanted to rule, I don't think that's necessarily true. He had a very clear conception of what sort of monarch he wanted to be. I simply believed he lacked the competence, lacked the political savvy, and ultimately lacked the inclination or the ability to be able to carry it off, which is one of the most ironic aspects of him, that you have this man who has a very clear conception of monarchy, yet he himself doesn't have the capabilities of being monarch, especially sort of in my own consideration. Because if you're not sort of capable by 26, for example, his contemporary, the Kaiser, became the ruler, in his early 30s, and he was, chomping at the bit and had all these grand conceptions of what he wanted to do upon, becoming Kaiser. Franz Joseph of Austria became the emperor at the age of 18, and he immediately had to fight a war for the survival of his state, a war which he won. And you could say, ironically, that the early decades of Franz Joseph are the most exalted. But when it comes to the Tsar, like I said, I simply believe you have a man who had no fundamental ability to read people, or I would say sort of genuine sort of political understanding in a Machiavellian sense. Because when it comes to a conception of monarchy, when it comes to a program of monarchy, you're going to see this again in terms of propaganda. It's very clear the conscious association he makes. He latches on to a particular Tsar to be his role model, which is, as you can see here, I've got this little image up on the left, which is the costume ball of 1903 at the Winter Palace. And Alexandra and Nicholas are dressed up respectively as Tsarista Maria and Tsar Alexis. Tsar Alexis was the second Romanov. He ruled from the 1640s until the 1670s, and he is known historically as essentially the quietist or the gentle Tsar, the peacemaker Tsar. And even through the naming of the Tsarevich Alexis, who will be born in 1904, the Tsar is consciously trying to emulate this figure of the peaceful, the quiet, the well-mannered Tsar Alexis. And even in the style of rule, you see this with the tricentenary celebrations. He's trying to harken back to this ancient sort of 17th century conception of what it means essentially to be a Russian monarch. And I think ironically, you can see quite a lot of the flaws in Alexis, in Nicholas at the same time. This overall commitment to peace, but as we're going to see, this general propensity to essentially blunder or incorrectly maneuver into a warlike situation, and then for Russia to be devastated as a result of it. you see almost the exact same scenarios. This constant instability throughout the reign of Alexis, dealing with all these social upheavals, this reliance on unpopular and corrupt ministers, in the case of Alexis, like Boris Mazarov, but also this desire to have a genuine Christian revival throughout the empire at the same time. In the case of Nicholas II, I would say after his marriage to Alexandra, he undertook a sincere religious conversion, which also again corresponded with all these grand notions of what it means to be a Russian monarch. And like Tsar Alexis is known principally for his religious reforms through taking Nikon and trying to purify the Russian religion by taking Orthodoxy, Eastern Orthodoxy, or Russian Orthodoxy, closer to its Greek origins. And that actually creates a schism within the church. And I think when you look at Tsar Nicholas II, very much he's trying to instill this Christian conception of monarchy, and you can say almost Christian revivalism. And this is not like a new or original. I mean, his father had tried to emulate the same position, and his father again had, with Probodenitsyov had tried to, wed the church essentially to his regime. And I think with Nicholas II, all you see is a continuation of this, albeit with less tact, I think is a fair assessment.
Yes, yeah, he wasn't overly tactful, I think. There's one thing you mentioned there, which sprung to mind, just a broad point about his character. I was reading something just the other day for this, about people talking about his character when he was a young man or a boy, really, or a teenager type times in his life. And someone described him as guileless. And that rang a bell with me. That's it. I think he was kind of a little bit naive and guileless, even into, well, his whole life, really. It does seem to ring true that, if you wanted to cultivate this sense of being quiet and being sort of peaceful, it does sort of all ring true. Absolutely. There's one other point, just where you talk about how quickly he was married to Alex. I feel like it's something of a shotgun marriage, sort of try to marry as quickly as possible, because if his father's death was unexpected, I can't remember what he died of. Did he have a heart attack or something? It was very quick, wasn't it? His father said,
I can't quite remember off the top of my head.
Yeah, it was something like that. He wasn't expected to die. Hadn't been ill for a long time or anything like that, and he suddenly sort of dies out of nowhere. And so, ideally, you really want the Tsar to already be married and have children, really, don't you? That's sort of the ideal situation. There's sort of most documentaries you see, or if you read a book about this, there's one of the famous lines that quite often gets trotted out, is that Alexandra is supposed to have said that her marriage felt like just a continuation of the sort of funeral of the late Tsar, just carrying on. Because like you said, it was like 1 week later or something they got married, and it wasn't with huge amounts of pomp and ceremony. It was sort of, as far as a Romanov wedding goes, it was low key. Of course, it's not really low key as far as normal people like you or I are concerned, but relatively speaking. So it feels like to me, what do you think? That it was just get it done as soon as possible. We need you guys to be married and start having kids as soon as possible right now, because I think she fell pregnant within 3 months or something. So do you think there's an element of that to it? It was just, okay, we didn't expect Dad to pop his clogs, but it's happened. So now we just need to tick all the boxes we possibly can as quickly as possible.
Yes, my assumption is that rather than this being a thing imposed on the young couple, rather I think the establishment at the time, even Alexandra's older sister, who became the Duchess Sergei, resisted this bitterly due to the effective protocols of how to observe a proper funeral. And this was, going against all those protocols. To my mind, it was done on the initiative of Alexandra and Nicholas, simply because they had made a commitment to each other. They had undergone essentially this deeper inner conversion, and they very, very vehemently believed that they had become dependent on one another. And Alexandra believed in abandoning the Tsar, to essentially go back to Germany before the effective protocols could be arranged for their marriage, a year later. She would have essentially been abandoning him at his weakest time. So I think it was actually a moment of love conquers all, rather than it was a moment of you can say a shotgun wedding, where there was this expectation that in order to ensure some form of stability, i.e. you mentioned, finding an heir, for example, to the throne. I mean, the Romanov dynasty had so many princes at this time. Even if Nicholas, something befell him, one of his younger brothers would have taken over. In this case, it would have been Prince George, because he hadn't died at this point. So I do think, again, this betrays an aspect of his personality, which is this is a relationship founded on love, and they are going to remain deeply committed to each other politically and personally right up until their deaths.
Interesting. Maybe to add just a slight piece of nuance there. There's no doubt in my mind, or in anyone's mind, really, anyone that looks at the sources, that they genuinely loved each other, had deep affection for each other. No doubt about that. But it's also a political marriage as well, isn't it? I mean, you mentioned before that ideally they would have wanted him to marry some sort of Russian noblewoman, some sort of Russian princess or someone around there. But nonetheless, short of that, he was required to marry someone of sort of royal stock. Right, and she was certainly that. I mean, she was a sort of a German princess, but was very close to even Queen Victoria. Apparently, she spent a lot of time. She was English speaking, spent a lot of time in her childhood in England, and I've heard it said that she was Queen Victoria's favourite granddaughter. Is that right?
Yes.
But and that she was very sort of prim, sort of quite prim and proper, and didn't really have much of a sense of humour. I mean, maybe it's a cliche that Germans are like that, but nevertheless, I think it's interesting that although it is, maybe it springs to mind Eleanor of Aquitaine and Henry II, it is a political marriage, not exactly arranged, but it's a political marriage, and they genuinely loved each other, fancied each other, were in love, truly. But to the point where, now this is my question to you, I wonder what you think, to the point where it seems a bit much. I mean, you mentioned something about they were sort of relying on each other, or had somehow decided that they were going to be some sort of really symbiotic relationship where they can't do without each other. And because of course we've got lots and lots and lots of letters, hundreds of letters that they sent to each other whenever they were apart, which is relatively often, with their jobs, that they would write to each other every single day, maybe more than once a day. And most of them survived, nearly all of them survived. The Bolsheviks didn't decide to destroy those. So we've got literally hundreds of letters they sent to each other. And do you think, maybe it's just me being cynical, maybe I've been hurt too badly, too often, but it seems like their love is weird. It's like, it's too intense. It's like they're 15 years old or something. Like loads and loads of nicknames for each other, and just sentences and sentences of how much they miss each other and love each other. These are two people that have been, some of these letters, the later ones, they've been married for decades. Okay. And I don't know, maybe it's just me. How do you feel about it? It just seems too intense. But maybe that's just my cynical 21st century view of it. What do you think?
In terms of a psychological assessment, I'm not qualified to offer that. In terms of like a general elaboration, though, I mean, they were very intense in the sense that they had all these very affectionate little nicknames, dear Nicky, dear wifey, etc. They refer to this, throughout their entire time. Also, one important point to note is that their best common language is, of course, English. So many of these letters are actually written in English again, which provides another invaluable source. But in terms of this, I think the broader implication is less, why were they in love? What were the sort of implications of their love? How did it affect the political system? I think in many cases it essentially isolated them from a lot of the court and from a lot of the larger Romanov family. Ironically, they became almost too dependent on each other, and ultimately too dependent on the children, and ultimately particularly Alexis, to the point where you can say that they were sort of almost, what's the best word to say? I would say naive, or again, as you mentioned, guileless, when it came to the broader situation of Russia, because there was this contained within this maelstrom. There was this family ideal. There was this idyll, essentially, within the middle of a storm. And even towards the end, the family maintains its unity, and right up to the end, one of the last things that Nicholas says, according to his executioners, is what, as if he's surprised by the fact he's going to be executed. And I think that sort of, to me, sort of reeks of like an archetypal tragedy, that there is this you can say idyllic family situation in the middle of this ultimately sort of revolutionary tumult. And of course, this was a political partnership. This was a personal partnership. They would, for example, come up with their own sort of political solution. In many cases, was to pray. They were, devoutly orthodox. And this brings me on to the point I really want to talk about, which is the first major disaster of the reign, which is the 1896 Khodynka field tragedy. Just after the coronation, hundreds of thousands of people had convened around the Moscow Kremlin, and hundreds of thousands of people gathered essentially to get free knickknacks and commemoration items for the coronation. And after a rumor went around that there was a limit on these commemorative gifts, this caused a stampede that killed 1,400 people. And worse than that, Nicholas II, rather than immediately going and making a PR stunt, essentially, showing his consideration for the victims, attends an embassy with his wife at the French embassy ball. Of course, Nicholas believed that he had an obligation to go to that ball. But again, I think this speaks to the ultimate guileless. And of course, before then, during the crisis, Nicholas and Alexandra had spent hours and hours within prayer. That was their own conception of how to do things, essentially. We are dedicated to the Russian nation. I am wedded to the Russian nation because of this coronation. And, essentially, we are devout believers in God, and we are going to pray to God to resolve this, completely oblivious of the earthly, secular, political ramifications of such a disaster. And I think this also sort of, again, relays another aspect of Nicholas's personality, which is his fatalism. All is as God wills, essentially. And I think a lot of people, especially when, for example, he hears the news of the loss at the Battle of Tsushima, take it as essentially meaning that he's some sort of aloof tyrant, essentially. The fact that he accepts all of this and he's so unmoved by all of it, he's not driven to sort of energy or motion essentially by it. There is this fatalism that regards all his actions, but I think again you could say it's an extension of a man who has this devout understanding of his relationship with God, essentially, and is, because of, again, you can say, this isolated family situation, immune from many of the political ramifications, or even the understanding of the implications of his actions. I mean, I also don't believe that this is just a thing relating to him and his wife either. I believe this is the sort of environment in which he was brought up. I mean, after the assassination of Alexander II, he, originally having been brought up in Tsarskoye Selo, the Catherine Palace, the Tsar's village, he and his family moved to Gatchina Palace, which was one of the very few palaces that Alexander III actually had outfitted with electricity. And in that palace, you have this very cultivated, close-knit, isolated family setting. And I think when you look at, again, Alex and Nicholas, you're seeing another repeat of that. So all of these elements, I think, again, combined, I know I'm being quite long-winded, create this psychological profile, again, of someone who isn't a politician by any stretch of the imagination.
Yeah, no, absolutely. He's not really cut out for almost any of the roles, because you have to wear many hats as a Tsar. It's not just one thing. It's not just like the Queen, our Queen today, who gets trotted out for state occasions, and it's all been done many, many times before. You'd have to have all sorts of interpersonal skills to be a good Tsar, I think. And he seemed to have very, very few of them. Another thing I remember Robert Massey saying, I think it was Massey, saying that Nicholas was one of those classic examples of whoever the last most convincing counselor or advisor he saw, he just parroted their opinion. Now, that's terrible in an autocracy, right? When you've got an absolute monarchy or near absolute monarchy, when you've got some type of autocracy, the guy at the top, the guy sitting at the very pinnacle of that, if he hasn't got a sort of a clear mind, his own mind, hasn't got a strong personality of his own, for better or worse, that's terrible. That's really terrible, because it's going to be only a matter of time before things just sort of start falling apart. But there's one thing I actually wanted to say about that incident, that giant crush in the park. What's the name of the park? Your Russian is good. What's it called again? Begins with a K, doesn't it? Khodynka, right? Okay, I won't even attempt to pronounce that correctly. But so that's straight after his coronation, isn't it? I mean, so it's immediate. It's like the first thing that happens. He ascends to the throne. There's this shock that the father has died. So then he gets coronated, and then this happens pretty much immediately. So historians can or do look back at it and say, it's sort of it doesn't bode well. It does cast a pall sort of immediately
Well,
over the reign. And
it doesn't bode well from the historian's perspective. Well, of course, something that Nicholas would always harken back to is, I was born on the day of St. Job the long-suffering. I am here to endure, and I'm here to endure in perpetuity all of the, basically take Shakespeare, slings and arrow of our great misfortune. And of course, he's also versed in the prophecy of Abel, for example, who says, the dynasty will end by 1918. So again, I think this just cements this fatalistic aspect of his personality.
That's very interesting, that thing that he had some sort of fixation with. Maybe that's a bit strong, but certainly identified in some ways with Job. I mean, that's interesting, isn't it? That sort of says a fair bit, out of any biblical character you could pick. But this thing, this crush in that park, in order to get some, it was like some food and some trinkets. I think there was like a commemorative mug or something that everyone wanted to get, and so there's a huge crush, and sort of 13, 14 odd hundred people died. It's easy just to say that, isn't it? 13, 1400 odd people were crushed to death. That's actually going to be a scene of horror, isn't it? That's going to be something that's sickening to actually see. And I think that Nicholas, correct me if I'm wrong on this, but he blamed himself, or sort of, despite other massacres and mass killings and even World War One, apparently he would still hark back to that particular crush right at the beginning of his reign in 1894, is it, or 96, 94, and that sort of that caused some sort of scar on his psyche as well. Am I overstating that?
No, I think that's fair. And this is, again, I think this just alludes to the fact you have these constant tragedies, and you could say this is the first of the great tragedies, and so in that sense it will have the greatest implication. And again, it's remember, it's the direct association with that and the coronation at the same time, that if the coronation is supposed to set the standard for how you're going to rule into perpetuity, you've been anointed in the manner of Christ, you set your coronation oath, this is the way in which you're going to rule. The fact that there is a stampede and there is a tragedy on the day of your coronation, you can say seals the first day in blood, and this is going to be, this, of course, the tragedy of the Savior on spilt blood, like his grandfather Alexander II. But if it's all right, I just want to move on to how essentially he governed, this autocratic period of the first 10 years of his reign. Yeah, so his father had established the Okhrana in 1881 to replace the third section of the Imperial Chancellery, i.e. the original secret police. And of course, the Okhrana will be the Tsarist predecessor to the Cheka, and eventually, of course, the NKVD and the KGB. Rather than, abandoning the system in line with his, peacemaker Alexis-esque system of government, he extends this. And he empowers people such as Zubetov, who pioneered this form of essentially police socialism, by which all of the various trade unions are going to be infiltrated by police activists. And of course, one of the effects of this also is that many police agents are behind atrocities which are later blamed on socialists to try and discredit the political movements of socialists. And of course, one of the effects of this is that members of the Tsarist regime are actually victims of this police socialist regime, so including the interior minister von Plehve. And then you have like members such as Bratchkovsky again, and the infiltration of the Bolshevik party, etc. So on the one hand, Tsar Nicholas is trying to inculcate this idea of, mild-mannered, polite policemen, as ridiculous as that sounds, as being as the extension of Tsarist government and this Christian conception of rulership. And yet, on the other, the Tsar doesn't have any qualms, essentially, with going into these very sort of subversive military tactics and empowering these people, especially in 1905, when it looks as if the Tsarist regime is going to collapse. And of course, this brings us onto the first sort of disaster of his reign, major disaster, which is the Russo-Japanese War. And I think this again is something which really needs to be understood, as his father had successfully kept the empire at peace for 12 years, for 13 years. And for that, he was known historically as the peacemaker. In the manner of, an Alexis, Nicholas II tried to follow in that mold. And we have the 1899, Hague Peace Conference, where there is some sort of general commitment towards, peace in perpetuity, and the various sort of standards for which will sort of arrange, laws regarding, the proper conduct of war. He very enthusiastically throws himself into that. Yet at the same time, you see his incompetence showing through and how he basically blunders into war. And this is perfectly showcased in his policy towards Japan. with Japan, Russia had been expanding into Russia, into the Chinese Empire, into the Qing Empire in terms of its influence. It had already, created the city of Vladivostok, which in Russia literally means ruler of the East. And I think, if anything, the name of that city should indicate the level of Russian ambitions towards their expansion in that direction. We see the investment in the Mukden Manchurian Railway, and now we see economic and political penetration into Korea. And this, of course, would mean that, with now a Russian concession in the Liaoning Peninsula in Port Arthur in China, and increased Russian influence in Korea, that Russia is trying to establish, the Near East, the Far East, the Pacific, as this new sort of outlet for, Russia's grand sort of imperial ambitions. And the Japanese, who have just recently modernized, they've gone through their Meiji Restoration, they've imported, many elements of European sort of industrialization, constitutionalism, and of course, a British imported navy, are now thinking, well, we want to have our own sphere of influence. We want to have our own sphere of influence in Korea in particular, because Korea is the only place where you can really launch a successful invasion of Japan. And so this Russian encroachment in Korea to the Japanese is basically seen as, a fundamental threat to their national security. But rather than dealing with the threat of Japan effectively, the Tsar instead passes off, the Japanese embassy to, low-ranking civil servants who just, fog off the Japanese concerns with, protocolic, oh, it's, we can't talk about this issue, oh, it's just economic concerns, oh, we're not interested in Korea, essentially. And so because the Japanese feel effectively hamstrung by this, there's no avenue for peaceful negotiations regarding Korea. They respond in 1904 by destroying the Pacific Squadron, the Russian Pacific Squadron at Port Arthur, which begins this major military calamity by which the Russians have to remember that, in terms of its overall development, Russia is vast, and Russia has only just completed, by the middle of 1904, the Trans-Siberian Railway. And the Trans-Siberian Railway, I don't think it was envisaged to be able to carry, haul all these troops all the way from St. Petersburg through to Moscow, through to Vladivostok, to conduct a war on this scale, thousands and thousands of miles away from the heart of the empire, which is European Russia. So from the beginning, the Russians do incredibly badly. And to make matters worse, they then, in response to the loss of the Pacific Squadron, send the Baltic Sea Fleet around a 6-month journey around the Cape of Good Hope. Of course, the British are allied to the Japanese. They don't allow them access to the Suez Canal. And within hours of entering Japanese waters, the Strait of Tsushima, the entire Baltic fleet is sunk. And this is, you could say, one of the worst military disasters in Russian history. And this acts as the impetus for the Kronstadt mutiny, the mutiny of Russian sailors in the capital. And at the same time, this is on the 22nd of January 1905, a police informant leads a pro-Tsarist delegation to the Winter Palace to try and arrange for better, working conditions for the St. Petersburg proletariat. And rather than, this speaks to his guilelessness and his incompetence regarding tact. Nicholas II is aware of this because the leader is a police informant, Father Gapon, and he is recommended by his interior minister to be at the Winter Palace in Moscow, because of course he's not living in the Winter Palace, he's living in Tsarskoye Selo outside the city, to receive this petition and make a show of it, essentially. These are my loyal, petitioners coming, and I will, of course, I'm concerned with the condition of the working man. Nicholas refuses to do so, and makes the issue worse by sending in the cavalry. And he believes the cavalry will be there to prevent a possible massacre. And of course, without his direct oversight, and essentially the cavalry being spooked by the size of the crowd, there is a impromptu cavalry charge into the crowd, and this is the Bloody Sunday Massacre, essentially, all of which could have been avoided, and combined with the disastrous war against Japan, acts as the perfect catalyst to, allow for this revolution of 1905, in which the Tsar's response is to combine, political reforms at home with this, you can see military response and police response, bringing in hardliners such as Trepov and Rachkovsky to, try and undermine and, remove the protesters, bring in, loyalist peasant gangs such as the Black Hundreds to root out revolutionary action, whilst at the same time trying to establish a makeshift constitution. And people such as Goromenkin and Segevita are very enthusiastic about this. They believe this is Russia taking a constitutional course, kind of like Britain, or if not Germany or Austria. And it's very clear right from the beginning of the fundamental law of the new Russian state in 1906 that the Tsar, at his first summons to this new Duma, promulgates that he intends to defend Russian autocracy, absolutely, and he intends to pass it unbroken to his son. So right from the beginning, you can see that this Duma, as envisaged, is not a new conception of monarchy or constitutional rule. Rather, it's a temporary measure by which the Tsar will pacify the remnants of this revolution, essentially. At the same time, he'll be working consistently to undermine it.
Yes, very, very interesting. So there's a few things to unpack, a few events happened almost on top of each other, didn't they, there in 1905? Sort of a big year. And I think it's totally fair to say that the monarchy survived by the skin of its teeth there. It seems extremely close to being toppled in 1905. But first of all, then the war with Japan. That's really is a turn up for the books, isn't it? That one. I mean, the Japanese had been furiously trying to modernize over the last few decades. I think we said the adoration of the Magi there, a completely different thing. That, but the fact that you mentioned there that they'd been working very closely with the British in order to modernize their navy. Not just sort of designs of ships, but how officers conduct themselves and things. Because of course, the Royal Navy was the best of the best at the time. There's no one better to sort of learn from, I suppose. And so when they do have their when it does come to blows with the Russian fleets, it's still a turn up for the books that they annihilate them. Really, I mean, it's a complete win, isn't it? The Russians have to sign really a fairly humiliating treaty at the end of that. There's no doubt that the Japanese decisively won there.
Yes, the Treaty of Portsmouth is you can say, given how decisively the Japanese won that war, it was actually quite a slap in the face to the Japanese. There were actually riots at home in Japan once the Treaty of Portsmouth, which was, again, it was
I did not know that.
I did not know that. Because territorially, the Japanese only gained South Sakhalin from the Russians, which is the furthest eastern island. Well, not the furthest east, but it's just east of Vladivostok. And the Japanese were hoping for at least the entire island, and they were hoping for the instant annexation of Korea, which doesn't happen for another 5 years. All of these things were delayed. However, the ultimate implications of this treaty are that Russia loses Port Arthur, Russia loses influence over Manchuria and over Korea, and loses this tiny territorial concession in Sakhalin. But the Japanese at home, considering the scale of their victory, and given the fact, again, they had defeated one of the European great powers, this is nothing compared to the defeat of the Crimean War, in which the Russians lost against the two leading European powers other than itself. This is now losing against a third-tier power, which only 40 years before didn't have a navy at all to speak of beyond, wooden ships. Now they are defeating the navy of Peter the Great, which had been established, some 200 years before. This is a complete, unambiguous disaster. And the conception, of course, within the Western media at that time was that the Tsar had, destroyed his prestige, and that he was also a tyrant, combining that with the Bloody Sunday Massacre. Even as I mentioned, that wasn't intentional malice, that was just incompetence.
Yeah, that's interesting. So, I mean, I suppose, I hadn't really thought about how differently that the peace was considered on different sides. But certainly, at least then, from the Russian side, it was humiliating. You know, a
Yes.
real shrinkage of their
Yes,
authority on the world
absolutely.
stage.
To summarize, Russia had been basically blocked from expanding into the Far East thereafter. And this is why you see such a dramatic reorientation of the Tsar's foreign policy towards the Balkans after this, because that's really the only, apart from Iran, the only avenue of future expansion.
And the Bloody Sunday thing, I've said this, I think, on more than one of my videos, but I'll say it again, is that there's lots of Bloody Sundays in history, aren't there? It seems that almost whenever there's a massacre on a Sunday, it ends up being called Bloody Sunday. So if you go on Wikipedia, there's many Bloody Sundays you can read about. But this one, I've heard it said that there were lots of people that weren't particularly radical, and I'm not really talking about leftism or anything, but people that weren't particularly radical or had been particularly, you know, they weren't prepared to fight and die one way or another, that the 1905 uprising, rebellion, and the way that it was put down, Bloody Sunday being just one element of that, that's what sort of woke a lot of people up or turned a lot of people off, whichever way you want to look at it. But that was a really big event. It's not just like just one more event, but that was sort of key in a lot of people's minds. Am I getting that right, do you think?
Yes, I think again, the fundamental point to realize is that these are loyal subjects of the Tsar asking for a modest increase in their material conditions being mowed down by Tsarist cavalry. There was really no excuse for it. There was no prompting of it. And as I said, the whole event was essentially stage managed by the police themselves because of the fact that police were aware of this and a police informant had led the original, again, charge. So again, it was a perfect propaganda opportunity by the Tsar to prove that he was on the side of the ordinary men of St. Petersburg. And this opportunity is ignored. The Tsar refuses to go along with this, and you have this completely avoidable massacre. And therefore, we have this, creation of the Duma. And again, the Duma disappoints a large number of, liberals who had expected this moment for Russia to finally become a constitutional and Western-style monarchy. First of all, you have the Duma of 1906, which is dissolved. You have the Duma of 1907, which this time is more radical than the previous Duma. It includes Social Democrats, Bolsheviks, Mensheviks. The Bolshevik and Menshevik factions, of course, have been formed a few years earlier, and social revolutionaries. And in response to this, rather than deal with this new Duma, the Tsar boycotts it again. And he appoints, as you can see on the right-hand side, Peter Stolypin, who was one of the few governors to actually deal with the revolution effectively in his own province, to become the new chairman of the Council of Ministers, or effectively the prime minister of the Russian Empire. And he tweaks the constitution to create a third Duma, essentially, with a new electorate to become loyal to the Tsar, essentially. And we have essentially this massive, universal from 1905 to 1907, the suppression of strikes, peasant revolts. However, there's also a carrot and stick approach, I think it's fair to say, with Stolypin. On the one hand, you have the stick approach, which is the deaths of some 3,000 to 6,000 revolutionaries across Russia. And on the other hand, you have the fact that Stolypin is more than prepared to work with the local democratic councils of Russia, namely the Zemstvos. Essentially, he wants to try and use the newly created Duma, which is, as I mentioned, the Tsar was contemptuous of, and the local democratic institutions, which had been established by Alexander II, to accentuate Tsarist rule. And from this end, he's actually opposed by both the left, who believe he's a vicious tyrant who carried out these massacres, and by figures on the right who believe he's fundamentally undermining the nature of Tsarist autocracy at the same time. So Stolypin is quite an interesting figure in this regard, in that he was considered neither, especially in Russia, to be on the left or on the right. I mean, people are mentioning in the chat, why didn't Nicholas II resign? There was this anticipation within the army, or radical elements of the army, that a new Tsar should be installed if Tsar Nicholas II basically failed during this time. And in fairness to Tsar Nicholas II, he didn't lose his throne. He was able to find a competent minister who he could rule through it in the form of Stolypin. Had that not happened, it's possible that the Tsar himself could have been overthrown by a monarchist coup, and replaced by a far more, you could say, admired and effective Romanov, such as Nikolai Nikolasha, one of his cousins. And this, I think, is, again, important to note about the character of Nicholas II. I mean, Nicholas II was chided throughout his life for not having basically the imposing stature of a Romanov. I mean, one of the quintessential aspects of the Romanovs, be it, his forebear Peter the Great, be it his father, Alexander III, be it his great-grandfather, were that the Romanovs were essentially giants. And what is sad about Nicholas II is that he is the byproduct of two formidable personalities, one in the form of Alexander III and one in the form of Maria Feodorovna of or Dagmar of Denmark. However, he only tends to inherit you can say, the worst aspect of his mother's genealogy, which is her shortness, and this carries through. And as a result, he's basically demoted. I'm not going to take orders from a dwarf. And you see these interactions with his various soldiers, where many soldier interactions were referred to the Tsar as awkward. You have a particular obsession of the Tsar to create this cult of this new saint, the Saint Seraphim, the cult which has essentially the saint who had essentially interceded to allow for Alexandra to give birth to Alexis. And he seemed more concerned about that than the actual progress of the war. So all of these elements, again, what made Nicholas II despised by both the left and the right. And I think, again, this is epitomized in Stolypin, but I think in fairness to the Tsar, had he not appointed Stolypin, the chances are that Russia could be dissolved. I mean, in terms of his radical reforming zeal, Stolypin wanted to, again, bolster this alliance between the local village communities, or the Murs, and the Tsarist government. He wanted, the peasantry to be the bulwark, basically, of Russian conservatism. Yet at the same time, he wanted land reform. So he wanted to abolish, the remnants of the old manorial, serf strip system. He wanted agricultural efficiency to increase so that the periodic famines throughout the Russian Empire would stop. And at the end of his career in 1911, he is assassinated by an assassin known as Bogrov. And on the one hand, he's a Jewish socialist, so the idea is, he's obviously been assassinated by the left. But even to this day, there is an assumption that he could have been put up to it by elements of the Russian right. But the point is, by 1911, Russia is actually on the mend. Its economy is growing again. They're reforming their military. They're refocusing their efforts towards expansion of the Balkans. Many ministers of the Foreign Office, including the brother-in-law of Stolypin, Sazonov, are promoted alongside him and will survive him. And this is the situation we get to, where you could say is the twilight of the monarchy. And you mentioned earlier the tricentenary celebrations. I think this is quite an interesting sort of case study into how we analyze, the way the Tsarist regime wanted to be remembered, or how Nicholas II, viewed himself. I've been alluding to these precedents regarding sorry, my brain stopped. Regarding Alexis, Tsar Alexis, and this conception of 17th century, ancient Romanov monarchy. Well, the desired sort of tour of the tricentenary is actually imitating Tsar Michael I, the first Romanov, by which the Tsar goes around to the old Principality of Muscovy, and he visits all the towns which Tsar Michael had originally done in the early 17th century. And throughout, there's this creation of the cult of one Ivan Susanin. Ivan Susanin had been a local peasant who, during the time of troubles, had saved the life of Tsar Michael. And the conscious, you can say, the creation of the cult of Ivan Susanin is this idea of creating this, as I mentioned with Stolypin, this alliance between the rural sort of honest peasant and the Tsar, the fact that they are natural allies in this. And at the same time, we have, the Alarus period in Russian culture. We have the rise of the Five. We have the rise of Modus Mussorgsky. We have the rise of Glinka. And coinciding with all of these tours, throughout virtually all of Russia, we have the playing of Glinka's A Life for the Tsar, which is basically modeled on the character of Ivan Susanin. So this idea, again, that the Russian emperor is trying to harken back to this ancient conception established by Alexis and established by Mikhail, is everywhere present when you look at the tricentenary performances. I mean, basically, it's a huge public display of propaganda, again, trying to solidify the idea in people's minds that the dynasty is strong. And despite the setbacks of the 1905 revolution, despite the setbacks of the Russo-Japanese War, the Tsar essentially is going to cultivate this ancient orthodox relationship with his people, by which he is their protector. And you see, again with Rasputin later on, the Tsar wanting to be loved is basically the little father. The little father was one of his favorite characteristics, or, in Russian, batushka, which just essentially means father. All of these little elements were cultivated here. And I think when you look at the tricentenary, it's the culmination of all of these aspects of how the Tsar wanted to be viewed in one single event.
Interesting, very interesting. I mean, just a very broad question. I mean, I wonder if you think if World War One had somehow never happened, whether he would have never been dethroned. But it's interesting, the thing you say about him being short. It's funny how often that comes up when you do hear of accounts of particularly soldiers. They're used to other members of the family, because the Romanov family was huge, and they were nearly all very tall, if not extremely tall. And so to find that the Tsar himself is actually really quite small. I can't remember what his actual height was, but it was sort of below average.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So it's a little below average. I mean, he's not an absolute midget, but that's short, really, isn't it? 5'6". I mean, so yeah, that is interesting. That he was sort of physically small and sort of small of character, I think. And I don't mean that in a massively disparaging way. It just seems to be the case. Not that he was small-minded. I don't mean it like that, but just that he doesn't seem to have been very bombastic, put it that way, perhaps. And it's interesting that he was created a saint in the Orthodox Church. He is a saint, I believe.
Yes.
But so there's very, very different ways of looking at him, aren't there? On one level, you could say he's saintly, and on another level, other epithets he had during his life was like Bloody Nicholas, or Nicholas the Slaughterer, Bloody Sunday, and all the things Stolypin did to retain power. There is a fair bit of blood there. I mean, not that Nicholas himself would have had anything to do with it. It's not like one of those like Peter the Great, physically getting involved himself in executions. Nothing like that, not remotely. And so yeah, he's sort of really quite nice, polite, quiet family man, not a slaughterer, not really steeped in blood exactly.
Well, there's another comparison. There's another comparison I want to bring up, which I don't mean to hark on, but I've been alluding to the fact that he consciously styled himself on the quiet Tsar, the gentle Tsar, Tsar Alexis. Tsar Alexis, in my view, was responsible for one of the most prolonged periods of barbarity in Russian history, which is the so-called deluge of anyone who's Polish or Lithuanian in the comment section will know what I'm talking about, in which during the 1660s, the Swedish and the Russians occupied and basically ravaged the countryside of Poland and Lithuania, which had been one of the largest states in Europe, and caused untold misery and demographic catastrophe to that province. And he'd essentially, Tsar Alexis had wanted to essentially annex the entire eastern half, the Lithuanian half of the Commonwealth outright. And of course, this caused a blunder with which he got involved in a disastrous war with Sweden, a la Nicholas II, and ended up with very little. So I think, again, very weird, and you have these almost direct comparisons you can bring in here. But regarding the height issue, European monarch, I mean, I don't really want to harken on about this point because it's a rather superficial point in general, but it's loads of European monarchs at the time were short. I mean, the King of Italy, Vittorio Emanuele III, was about sort of 4'10". It's incredible seeing these little images of him, running around, standing next to any other king. And of course, the British royal family are also notoriously short at the same time. But why did it matter so much with Nicholas? Not only was he, technically the chief of the armed forces, so there's an expectation that he had to exude this militaristic air, but it's the fact that he was short by comparison. He was short by comparison to what the expectations of a Romanov prince were. And like I said, I bring this back to Nikolai and Nikolasha. Nikolai was essentially the Romanov ideal personified, this great sort of bombastic militaristic figure who was seen as an alternative Tsar, if ever Tsar Nicholas II essentially wavered. And in comparison to that, and of course, Nikolasha will be the first commander-in-chief of the Russian armies during World War I. before he's replaced in 1915. You have Nicholas II by comparison. But of course, Nicholas II wanted to assume that military position. He'd assumed it during the Russo-Japanese War, and he tries to assume it as the direct commander-in-chief of the armed forces at Stavka during World War I at the same time. So all of these things, I think, again, contribute to this idea, which you wouldn't have thought his height would have mattered that much in the great significance of things. But in terms of the perception of the Tsar as this military, or as the Kaiser would refer to himself as the supreme warlord, none of this helps from an angle of physiognomy.
Yeah, interesting. It's funny you should say that a lot of the ruling families were like that, because there's a sort of relatively famous picture of him standing next to his cousin, King George, and they're the same height, aren't they? They look very, very similar in all sorts of ways, and yeah, they're pretty much the same height. So yeah, not actual midgets, but not tall, just not imposing, not physically imposing. And it's surprising, isn't it, how far that. How much that counts for, at least in the mind of soldiers. I mean, well, when he named himself as commander in the field during World War One, apparently the soldiers, whenever he'd get off a train somewhere and they would see him, they were like, "Well, where's the Tsar? It's obviously not that guy." oh, it is. That is the Tsar. That's him. Oh dear. But yeah, well, it's a pretty superficial point, really. Perhaps it's not best to waste our time on it. But I suppose it's interesting that. Well, would we move on to World War One and the sort of large events before that?
There's one point I want to bring up before getting to the road to war, which is, you can see on this map here, one of the policies which Nicholas again prosecuted very viciously, and you can say again in the manner of his father and great-grandfather, is this policy of Russification. Under the late reign of Alexander III, many of the areas which have been granted, ancient historical concessions, such as the Baltic Germans in modern-day Latvia and Estonia, has their rights essentially impugned on, and these areas became directly administered by St. Petersburg. Then you have other areas which the Tsar's grandfather Alexander II had made great pains to ingratiate himself with the Finnish population. Finland is an interesting situation, is an interesting scenario in the case that Finland had been part of Sweden for hundreds and hundreds of years before the Russians annexed it at the beginning of the 19th century. And so rather than trying to Russify Finland, Tsar Alexander II actively courted Finnish public opinion simply so that Finland would begin to adopt a pro-Finnish outlook rather than the pro-Swedish outlook. So there was quite a underlying sort of element of Machiavellian strategy regarding Finland. However, even these small concessions, which have been granted, to Finland, and of course the Tsar was, Tsar Alexander II was very harsh when it came to the Poles at the same time. These were rolled back under Nicholas II. So he began to, impose the same restrictions which have been imposed on the Baltic states in Finland at the same time. And in response to this, you have, Sibelius, creating his famous Finlandia Symphony as some form of small rebellion against the Tsar. And I think this again accounts for the fact that Finland was so prepared to to remove the shackles of Tsarist autocracy and declare themselves independent, even though compared to other areas of Russia, they had virtual autonomy. But again, I think this all speaks to the element that he was a ruler trying to rule very much in the manner of his predecessors in this ancient conception of autocracy, orthodoxy, and nationality. But as we can see, of course, the question is, had World War I not happened, would he have reigned and died as a ruler essentially and allowed the Romanov dynasty to continue? My contention on many of the appearances I made on YouTube is that Russia has an active role in the build-up of World War I, and in that sense, I find it very difficult to separate the Tsar from this, because again, going back to the Russo-Japanese War, it's a war essentially which could have been avoidable, which he blunders into. And you can say Russia has one of the most superficial reasons for getting involved in that conflict, but I'll just illustrate this. As I mentioned, with the Russo-Japanese War, Russia had been locked out of influence in the Far East. Now it was Japan's domain, essentially, in competition with Britain, which had, Japan had tried to ameliorate that by making Britain its ally. In 1907, Britain and France formed the Triple Entente with Russia. Just to give a little bit of context before that, as I mentioned, the French and the Russians have been allies since 1894. And right from the beginning of his reign, during the first couple of decades, Austria and Russia had been on good relations. And the foreign minister of Austria in particular, Alois von Aehrenthal, was determined to maintain this détente, whereby, the great powers weren't deliberately hostile to Russia. And the then foreign minister, Izvolsky, conceded this idea with this great sort of pan-European alliance, Russia can gain a major territorial concession or major sort of prestige point to obfuscate for the fact that Russia had been so disastrously humbled in the Russo-Japanese War, which is we are going to open up Constantinople, we're going to open up the Straits, and Russian ships, like as I mentioned all the way back with the Treaty of San Stefano, will have access to the Mediterranean and ultimately will have access to the Suez Canal. Of course, this is done basically as a quid pro quo for the annexation of Bosnia-Herzegovina. Izvolsky, however, is essentially betrayed by his own side, betrayed by public opinion, because the Serbian state, which has been now allied with Russia since the Abramovich dynasty was wiped out and Serbia adopted a pro-Russian foreign policy in 1903, wanted to annex that region because it had a large number of Slavs, even though it had been under the occupation of Austria and it was technically part of the Turkish Empire. So the Serbs really had no right to it other than this conception of pan-Slavism, which the Russians were more than willing to use as a tool for expansion. And so as a result of this diplomatic blunder involving the Russian foreign minister trying to gain this access to the Straits, there is this call in 1908 for war with Austria-Hungary because of its annexation of Bosnia-Herzegovina. That and the fact that the French and the British have backstabbed Russia and won't allow it to access the Straits at the same time. And this creates basically the general setup for the complete collapse in Austrian-Russian relationships when it becomes clear from the Russian point of view that Russia is essentially losing the influence game in the Balkans. Germany is expanding its economic relationships there. They're building railways. They're cultivating relationships with Romania. They're cultivating relationships with Bulgaria. They've, of course, cultivated a relationship with the Sultan in Constantinople, the Ottoman Sultan. They have better relationships with Greece. The Austrians have just made it possible for an independent Albanian state to exist in 1913. And so by 1914, Russia has almost been locked out of another sphere of influence due to, you can say, diplomatic incompetence on their end. And Serbia and, by lesser extent, Montenegro are the only allies essentially Russia has within that region. And it doesn't help either that the new Russian foreign minister who had risen alongside Stolypin, Sazonov, and of course the French at the same time, the French appoint Poncai as president and as foreign minister. And from 1912, there grows, I would say, a willing acceptance by the French and the Russian side to engage in hostile relationships with Austria-Hungary. And there's even this expectation that we're going to divide up Austria-Hungary. And again, you can say it's due to this aggressive preconditions of these ideas of the Orthodox protector in the form of the Tsar and this pan-Slavic identity. The Austrians have, Poles, they have Ruthenians, they have Czechs, they have Croatians, they have Slovenians, they have Slovaks, all of which can be liberated essentially by the Russians, parceled out under Russian influence. And this, forms a large part of World War I Russian plans. And so after the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, the Austrians use this as an opportunity very simply, because I've just had a stream on Monday where I was trying to go into this in more depth, where they're trying to seize on this opportunity to have a casus belli to take out a hostile government in Serbia, to prevent Serbia potentially forming an alliance with Russia and attacking Austria at a later date. Essentially, it's a preemptive war from the Austrian point of view. Of course, this goes disastrously badly. The Germans get involved. The Germans support the Austrians. Rather than the Russians backing down, as was the expectation, the Russians begin mobilizing on the 24th of July. And on the 29th of July, and there's one point we haven't mentioned, which is the infamous Willie-Nicky correspondence. We've been talking about how Russia was allied to France, but throughout this entire time, Nicholas and Wilhelm II were fast friends. In fact, there was even this brief moment during the Russo-Japanese War where it looked like Nicholas II and Wilhelm II would form another alliance. There was even a private meeting where they basically agreed the fundamental principles of an alliance. And of course, this was shot down by the Foreign Office. The day before the general mobilization of the Russian forces was ordered by Sazonov on the 30th of July, the Tsar had agreed in principle not to mobilize the army based on the intercession of the German Kaiser. Of course, the next day, Sazonov basically convinces the Tsar to do otherwise. And again, I think this betrays another fatal point in the Tsar's personality, which is his ability to only listen to the last man who essentially gave him advice. There's also this expectation that he doesn't have the steel, essentially, to stand up to the Austrians at the same time. So I think there's a psychological motivation for doing it. And on the 30th of July, we have the general order to mobilize. And this gives Germany all the impetus it needs to declare war on Russia and, of course, France, who are directly militarily allied at this point. And, of course, this leads to World War I. And I think, again, in terms of trying to look at, the Tsar's proposal, very early on in the war, Russia does very well against the Austrians, very badly against the Germans, but very well against the Austrians. They win the Battle of Galicia and occupy the eastern part of the Austrian half of the empire for, nearly a year. And they also take one of the greatest fortresses in Europe, the fortress of Przemysl, from the Austrians. And over this territory, the Tsar comes in and he establishes this, Ruthenian, Ukrainian population who are mainly Orthodox, albeit Orthodox in the Catholic Rite, not in the Eastern Rite. We are essentially Slav brothers. You have always been part of Russia. So I think in terms of looking at the Tsar as the peacemaker, on the one hand, you have this, you can say, this dithering, this kindly countenance, this gentlemanly-esque figure. Yet on the other hand, you have all the elements of, his great-grandfather, Nicholas I, who is wanting to adopt this, pan-Slavic aggressive ideal and, of course, traditionally expand into the Balkans. So again, just emphasize that, in my view at least, Nicholas II is a man of many contradictions who is trying to deal with this legacy that he's inherited, yet at the same time doesn't have the competence or the tact or the ability to carry it out. Because whilst you have this success against Austria, you have this military disaster against the Prussians, the Battle of Tannenberg, later the battles of the Manchurian Lakes, later the Great Retreat of 1915. And there's only one short reprieve from that in the form of the Brusilov offensive, which again deals a significant blow against the Austrian forces, but fails to break the German forces. So Russia is still locked in this gridlock where, again, it has abandoned essentially most of its western provinces. And this is the situation where I think we haven't talked about Rasputin, but would you sort of like to, unless you have really wanted to critique a lot of what I've said, I think this is a good time to talk about Rasputin in general.
Yeah, unfortunately, time is ticking on, but yeah, there's loads there I'd love to pick your brain about, but maybe perhaps another time. Because, well, just quickly to say, I've always thought that the real responsibility for World War I kicking off lies with both the Russian and German high command. But if anything, I would sort of weight it maybe 70-30 to the Germans. I mean, I feel like they sort of convinced themselves that once Russia had started mobilizing, that they would have no choice. They've just got to do the Stolypin plan right now. I don't know if that's fair or if that's how you think about it. But yeah, some sort of comedy of errors on some grand level. But one thing I did want to actually ask you about, if you could give me a little bit of detail about it, is that decision that Nicholas makes to appoint himself as commander in the field. It's easy to look back at it now and say that was an error. That was an error in judgment. Probably wasn't the best thing to do because, as 99 Iron Duke in the comments pointed out, he's not a military man. He was never trained, as an officer or anything. He's certainly not famous for having sort of any sort of grand strategic sense or anything. So, do you think that is one of an important seed to his ultimate destruction, or not so much? How do you feel about that?
Yes, I do. Well, I hate to sort of engage in too much of counterfactual history, alternative history, because you run away with the absence of facts and pure speculation.
Sure.
But just to illustrate, why that point was so significant, Bo. We mentioned, you of course illustrated how he had very little in the way of a military upbringing. In this case, he's actually an anomaly within the grand scheme of European monarchs. Of course, Wilhelm II and the Austrian heir to the throne, Franz Ferdinand, who of course was assassinated in 1914, had exceptional military expertise and were active military men. Of course, the Kaiser was very enthusiastic when it came to military affairs, but of course he was like his cousin, militarily and tactically incompetent, and so had to be physically removed by the chief of staff in order not to interfere in Germany's annual war games. However, with Nicholas, again, I look at this as this idea, this pure conception of the Tsar as honoring the coronation oath. My fundamental aim is to defend my people, and so I need to be seen as this leader in times of war. I need to be, effectively trying to emulate this idea of I'm on the field, leading my troops. And many, I was talking in my previous stream on Monday regarding Austria-Hungary, that even the Prime Minister of Hungary actually Istvan Tisza decided to take control of a regiment in order to deal with the trials and tribulations of being a frontline commander. Well, of course, the fatal problem with the Tsar's decision to, go to Stavka and become the direct commander of the forces of the front are manifold. The first reason, of course, is that he comes in at a terrible time during the Great Retreat, and now he's going to be blamed directly for all of Russia's continual losses. Another factor is that he's not really in command. He's simply at the headquarters, periodically with the Tsarevich Alexis, filing out reports, receiving intermittent news from St. Petersburg, and essentially being beseeched by various ministers to return back to now Petrograd. The city has now been renamed Petrograd due to the growing anti-German feeling, to deal with the situation which he has himself created, which is leaving his wife Alexandra as effectively the regent of Russia back in St. Petersburg. And this is a wonderful time to bring in Rasputin. Rasputin had been introduced to the royal family, I think just around the same time that Tsarevich Alexis was born. Of course, Tsarevich Alexis suffered from haemophilia, by which his blood wouldn't clot, and potentially any slight bruise would lead to fatal internal bleeding. The Tsarina in particular formed a very close relationship with Rasputin, because especially after 1914, she became convinced that Rasputin was the only man who could keep her son alive. However, before the war, Stolypin in particular had been very anxious to get Rasputin away from the imperial court, because whether, of course, there are many stories about him, which I think are fairly exaggerated, but the perception of the time was that he was a sexual fiend, and he was a charlatan, and he was, adopting this manner of the Siberian holy man, or in Russian, the starlets, to cultivate this, this whiter than white approach to the empress, while he was going around and sleeping with all the ladies of the royal court, essentially. Apparently, he was brimming with so much sexual energy that he could make a woman faint just by standing next to her. All of these elements, of course, led to lewd, scandalous, pornographic material being circulated throughout Russia, which of course led the Tsar to wanting to essentially search out and destroy all the printing presses in St. Petersburg. And this, of course, under a strong minister like Stolypin, Rasputin is banished from the court. It's one of the rare moments where Alexandra doesn't have complete sway over the Tsar. But in the absence of the Tsar, and in the absence of a strong minister to govern Russia on his behalf, and Alexandra being, left at home essentially to govern, Rasputin comes back. And Rasputin is essentially given the ability to vet ministerial appointments. And he is responsible for appointing many incredibly incompetent officials at a time where Russia needs incredibly good government, essentially, during times of war. What is astonishing about Russia is that, in contrast to its World War II performance, in which Russia becomes this manufacturing behemoth, Russia becomes so corrupt during the war period, essentially, that the entire sort of machinery of government begins to grind to a halt. It doesn't also help that conscription is so vast in Russia. Some 15 million men have been conscripted, that there is a constant lack of food in the Russian Empire. And I again put this down to the incompetence of the administration, because Russia has so many ample farms and food supplies, unlike Germany, where the population in the Austrian half of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and Germany are starving due to the blockade. So you have this incompetence. You have this man who is also considered a German agent, in cahoots with a German Tsarista, and appointing ministers such as Stormer, appointing ministers such as Protopopov, who is incompetent and universally hated, and is responsible for some of the harshest repressive measures towards the end of the regime. All of this coincides to this grand conspiracy to assassinate Rasputin by members of the Romanov family. I forget the particular prince, which is going to irk me, but nevertheless, getting onto it, we get to the legendary story of him where he is poisoned, he is shot, and he is drowned. Manages to survive many of those assassination attempts, but ultimately he is killed. There's also the suggestion of a MI6, British involvement in that, because of course he's a pro-peace advocate at the heart of the administration. Combine that with a German Tsarista, and you have a recipe for a complete disaster and loss of confidence in the Tsarist regime. All the time, you have the Tsar at the front, receiving these appellations from many loyal members of the government, including loyal members such as Rodzianko, the president of the Duma. The Duma, by the way, is periodically closed down and reopened, almost with no tact or consideration, to remove these incompetent officials. And in response, you have these, you mentioned the letter correspondence, you have these increasingly hysterical letters from Alexandra imploring the Tsar to a radical, you can almost say tyrannical action. To my mind, one of the famous letters from this, if I try to remember the exact quote, I'm fighting for reign and for baby, be Peter the Great, be Ivan the Terrible, essentially, crush your opposition underfoot. And of course, the Tsar shrugged this off and does nothing essentially from it. And the Tsarina is becoming increasingly isolated. Members of the Romanov family are now actively thinking about assassinating her or removing her from power. So there is a breakdown in the dynasty. There is a fundamental, split off between the Tsar and the home front. And the home front has basically been, there is no management. There is no central management. The entire machinery of government is collapsing. And to make matters worse, all the loyal troops are at the front with the Tsar. And all the, St. Petersburg, all the palaces, all you can say the territorial units of the Russian army are new recruits with questionable loyalties who are being sucked into this new revolutionary agitation, which is being poured out by Lenin, among others, and of course the Narodniks and the social revolutionaries. So to my mind, it's a perfect recipe for the disaster, which, of course, befalls Russia in 1917.
Yeah, again, a lot to unpack there. One of the things I would like to stress, you said there's sort of a few characters, a few figures in there that are considered by the normal Russian person to be probably some kind of German agent. Well, Alexandra herself she's German, isn't she? and a fool. The whole as you said, the machinery of government itself is falling apart because he left in her hands essentially, or her and Grigory Rasputin. Yet she becomes a figure that was already resented or was thought of with suspicion, if not just outright hated. And all that is just ramped up even more in his absence. And one of the things I also want to say is that, again, you mentioned just in passing there, that at least for a while, he took the Tsarevich with him. He took little Alexei with him to the front in 1915. Kind of a weird decision. Because they had to send him back for his own health in the end. It's very easy to sort of take a knock or something.
There's an important political consideration there, is that one of the successes of the dynasty is the ability to conceal the condition of the Tsarevich, and the Tsarevich had to be seen to be healthy. And so it was expected that he would go on military maneuvers with his father. And of course, I've shown an image here where he is accompanying a Cossack on the tricentenary here in 1913. The Tsar, he was even, placed on the images of like children's textbooks. The cult of the Tsarevich was everywhere. And the fact that they were able to conceal his conditions, again, is one of the few successes of the regime. So to my mind, that's not a mystery at all. The idea that the Tsar is already considered weak, and so the dynasty cannot deal with this sort of catastrophe at the same time. Even we'll get to the abdication if that's all right.
Yeah, sure. There was just one last thing. Just before we move on, just one last thing I just want to say that is an indication again of his Nicholas's personality, is that he's sending letters back and forth with Alex, and he cares more about that Alexei's had got a bruise on his arm than how many divisions he's lost or what the strategic situation is in the field. He's a doting father. He's not a general. I just wanted to stress that, really.
Yes, exactly. So just quickly getting to the revolution, there is a strike in St. Petersburg on the 10th of March. And again, in Russia, it's the old calendar, it's February Revolution, but in reality it's the March Revolution according to the Gregorian calendar. We have this massive strike of industrial workers. Then on the 11th of March, we have basically the defection of many of the Tsarist units who were basically ordered to fire. Instead, they fire on their officers, and there's general bedlam in the capital. And a couple of days later, it's essentially agreed between the loyalist elements of the Duma, the conservative elements of the Duma, be they figures such as Rodzianko and Prince Lvov, and army generals such as Guchkov, Alexeyev, Russky, to compel the Tsar to abdicate. Now, this again goes back to what I was saying about the Tsarevich. The expectation here was not to abolish the monarchy. The idea was simply to transfer a provisional government to the Duma and to have some form of figurehead Tsar basically legitimating the new regime. And the expectation was that the young Tsarevich would be perfect for this because he was young, impressionable, and so could be easily controlled in basically a perpetual regency. No one, of course, knew among the members of the Duma that he had hemophilia. So when the Tsar abdicates, he abdicates on behalf of him and of his son at the same time. And of course, the throne is then offered to the Tsar's brother, Tsar Michael, in theory, Tsar Michael. And Tsar Michael, instead, you can say either as an act of shrewd politics or an act of cowardice, delays the decision to be essentially, anointed as monarch in order for a better political situation where, he could basically guarantee that he was going to remain Tsar, essentially. He waits to have the consent or basically the democratic approval of the Duma, is his, exact phraseology. Of course, such a thing never happens. The conservative faction who originally formed the provisional government by Prince Lvov, even within St. Petersburg, you immediately have the system of the Latsia, or the dual power, essentially, between the Petrograd Soviet and disloyal regiments of the army, who are pro the Petrograd Soviet, and the official provincial government. And of course, by the summer, this gives over to the government of the social revolutionaries under Kerensky, who become, actively more hostile to the Tsar. But in terms of what happens to the Tsar at this point, because this is, of course, a discussion of Nicholas II, the Tsar is sent back to Tsarskoye Selo, where his family are, and he is greeted derogatorily as the Colonel Nicholas Romanov. He has lost all pretensions of his rank, even though, again, the monarchy hasn't officially been dissolved at this point. There is still this expectation that his brother Michael might still be the Tsar. So now the issue is, what to do essentially with the Tsar. Well, whilst there is a, you can say a friendly government existing in St. Petersburg, the Tsar and his family exist essentially as prisoners under house arrest in the palace, the Catherine Palace in Tsarskoye Selo, and they spend much of the summer there. However, when the Kerensky government comes in, it now comes to matters of what to do with them. How do we force them into exile? Now there's this general expectation among the new elite that the Tsar is if not an embarrassment, then a tyrant, and we need to do as much as possible to distance ourselves from him. Well, this is where we get to one of the great betrayals in history. First of all, the French reject him. Of course, the French having been allies with Russia since 1894, and the expectation, of course, that such premature military actions such as Tannenberg were meant as a means to save France during those crucial days of 1914. All of that is forgotten. All of Russia's sacrifices for the defense of France are forgotten, and the French betrayed them. Now the British betrayed them also, and it's important to note that this is a direct decision taken by King George V. Concerned, I would say too concerned by the prospect of revolution at home, he takes the decision against the wishes of his own prime minister, the liberal David Lloyd George, to basically ban the Tsar access to the country, and this basically seals his fate, because with no friendly power offering to give him amnesty, the Kerensky government decides to send him into exile to the governor's mansion in Tobolsk. And originally, under the Kerensky government, this is quite a favorable exile to them. They live in the governor's mansion in Tobolsk. They're allowed, some form of freedom. But in October and November, of course, you have the Russian Revolution, the Second Russian Revolution, the Soviet Revolution, by which the government, which had been basically, committed to war throughout this entire time and had always been unstable, had always been dealing with this aspect of dual power, is overthrown with barely a shot being fired due to this mutiny by much of, loyal sort of elite regiments in St. Petersburg, such as the Preobrazhensky movement, and of course the Navy defects and the ironclad Aurora, for example. And there is the storming of the Winter Palace, albeit that is much more sort of symbolic than anything else. You have the retreat of the Kerensky government, and now the fate of the Romanov dynasty is to be handled by the Bolsheviks. Now, for the first few months, their situation doesn't change that much. From November until April, they remain in Tobolsk, but from April, the royal family are moved segmentally. First of all, it's the Tsar and his wife, Alexandra, are moved to the Apatiev house in Ekaterinburg. And later in May, they're followed up by the four children, by the four daughters and Tsarevich Alexis. And from this point, it comes a matter, what to do with the Tsar. On the one hand, the Russians have just made peace with the Germans. They've just made peace with the Kaiser in the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. And ironically, if there is going to be one foreign agent who is actually going to save the Tsar, it's going to be the Kaiser at this point, because the Kaiser's ambassador is always checking in on the Russians to ensure that the Russian royal family are essentially protected now that there is the possibility of renewed conflict. The Germans, using this as a pretext to gain even more land at the expense of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. That and the fact that the Russian government from 1918 onwards, the middle of 1918, is now dealing with the Russian Civil War and the revolt of the White factions. So from May to July of 1918, the Russian royal family is basically kept in extreme seclusion within the Apatiev house, or what is named, rather ominously as the House of Special Purpose. First of all, many members of the entourage are split off from the royal family. Then some members of the entourage, including basically the sailor nanny of Alexis, is shot. Then you have, increasing security, so they can't, even leave their rooms essentially without, a guard following them at all times. And also they have to deal with the constant aspect of thievery. The Russians had taken vast amounts of, personal wealth with them when they went into exile. And of course, but by this time, all of the wealth of the Romanovs is being appropriated by the Ural Soviet, which is the local authority which is holding them captive in Ekaterinburg. And at the beginning of July, Yakov Yurovsky is appointed essentially to oversee the Apatiev house. And it's basically already been decided by the Sovnarkom, or rather 3 members of it, including Lenin, that the royal family has to die and that all members have to die. It's simply a matter of ensuring that it can happen in complete, secrecy, so as not to offend public opinion abroad, essentially, because the Russian royal family is still, again, got many supporters. And the Russian government essentially, again, is fighting this, you could say, the middle of 1918 desperate battle against the whites, and it'll only get worse from this point on. At the same time, you have the Czechoslovak Legion slowly moving eastwards, which had been, essentially made up of Czech regiments who, profess their loyalty to the Tsar, and then had become basically part of the white faction periodically after the revolution, after the second revolution in November. All of these elements again are, impounding on, the question of, the captors, the Tsar, Yakov Yurovsky. We need to essentially eliminate him quickly. If the whites can take over the Apatiev house and liberate the Tsar and his family, that they will be used as a potential rallying cry for the white movement, a legitimate source of unity of all the white factions, of which many of them are divided. And the family is murdered. I think it's midnight of the 17th of July. 1918. They're taken downstairs into the basement. I've got an image on the right here which shows the aftermath. And just to briefly summarize this, the orders are read out whereby they were going to be executed, for supposedly, again, aiding and abetting treason. The Tsar, astonished by this, shouts out, what, essentially. This, he believes he's basically been betrayed. He believes that this cannot happen. The adults in the entourage, because it's not just the Romanov family, also the family doctor and hangers-on there as well, are executed immediately. Sadly, though, the children survive the original cull, and most of the soldiers who have been essentially goaded into doing this have become very drunk as a result of this. So they weren't efficient killers. And Yakov Yorovsky had already had to purge the Apatiev house many times because so many of the local regiments weren't prepared to carry out the killing. Then many of the children, had sewn jewelry into their corsets to avoid it being confiscated by the local Soviet authorities. And so it was ordered that they would be bayoneted, but because of this, they survived. And so tragically, most of the children were then finished off by shooting at point blank range in the head. After this, the royal family was taken, they were disfigured with sulfuric acid, they were put in pitch, they were burnt to try and destroy all evidence. And the Soviets only acknowledged the fate of the royal family in 1926, 8 years after the fact. And during this time, Tsar Michael had also been executed. He'd been taken out into the fields a month before the Romanovs, and he'd been shot. And of course, the Empress's older sister, who I've mentioned quite a lot, the Grand Duchess Sergei, she had become a nun after her husband had been blown up in 1905. And she was thrown down a well, I think, and starved. And a lot of the Romanovs, I think about 30 of them were killed. However, some of them survived, and the Romanov dynasty lasted until uninterrupted in terms of there were direct people claiming to be descendants of the Tsar. In this case, it was the line of Prince Vladimir, who was the uncle of Tsar Nicholas II, and therefore his cousin Kirill becomes the pretender until the 1950s. And he's replaced by his son Vladimir. And when Vladimir dies, essentially the notion of who was the Tsarist pretender is all up in the air due to a lot of intricacies which are not really relevant to the stream. But nevertheless, from this point on, the Russian royal family have been, essentially eliminated. And that is the end of Tsar Nicholas. His body was exhumed after the fall of the Soviet Union. During the Glasnost period, you have more opening up about what happened to the Tsar. I mean, also during this time, because of even like the fact that the Soviets didn't acknowledge the deaths until 1926, leads to the rise of many imposters. Of course, the famous ones claiming to be Princess Anastasia. After 1998, the bodies are interned finally back in St. Petersburg. And as you mentioned previously, Bo, they are made saints in the Russian Orthodox Church. And the body remains then verified through, I believe it's Prince Philip, who was a close descendant due to the Danish royal family, of course, which the Tsar was directly descended through his mother. And they were. I think this is probably a good time, because I've been speaking a lot, Bo, for you to you explain or ask me any sort of questions, and then we'll get to the super chats.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, there's loads of details there. Sort of the sordid scene in that basement out in Siberia. That picture you've got up there on the screen is sort of a famous one, isn't it? And correct me if I'm wrong on this. I don't know if you know about this, but when I first saw that, sort of as a child, I suppose, you think, well, were they mowed down with a Bren gun or something? Why is the wall completely destroyed like that? I've heard that for whatever reason, the Soviets decided to dig all the bullets out of the wall, and that's why it looks so destroyed like that. I don't know if that's true or not, but certainly yeah, the idea that, that a lot of the children didn't die quickly. I think Alexei, one account I've read, he was the first to die, or the Tsar, and then Alexei would first die. But the girls, at least two of the girls, didn't die. Their sort of jewel encrusted, diamond encrusted corsets helped save them. And yeah, Guy would have to go up and put a slug through their head at point blank range. It was very,
regarding Alexis,
very,
it's worse than that. To my mind, the idea that Alexis was one of the first to die is to obfuscate from what actually happened to him, which is that he was probably the most bullet-ridden, sadly, of all the Romanov children. And just looking at that wall, as I mentioned, most of the executions were drunk. The level of sort of gunpowder fire going off, caused so much commotion that there was actually a lynch mob essentially that arose outside of the house, because of course many members in the Ekaterinburg were aware the Tsar was there, and it had only essentially been a diktat by the Ural Soviet, where any attempts to rescue and they'll instantly be killed prevented any sort of action. But of course you hear this violent shooting taking place, and of course the people around are familiar, know essentially who's in that house. And Yurovsky very, very sort of at one point it looks like he might be lynched, but the Soviets are able, regardless, to take the bodies away and bury them regardless. So no, it's a rather horrific and completely inhumane. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think the Soviets, the Russians, only allowed the archives they kept about it to be opened up after Glasnost, after sort of the 89. So very, very late. One question I did have for you, I know we're getting on with time, so feel free to make it brief. But one question I did have for somebody who knows more about this than I do is this. I know that the Bolsheviks had taken a vote years ago, like at the turn of the 20th century, long, long, long ago, that if they could ever, or if it was ever up to them, what they would do with the Romanovs would be to kill them. So I wonder why wasn't it among the first things that Lenin ordered? Why is there that hiatus there for months, really months, before it all comes? I get the thing that they might have be being rescued by the whites, therefore you have to pull the trigger right now. I understand that, but why weren't the Bolsheviks keener to bump them off sooner?
Right. Regarding your first point, that came up during I believe the London conference in 1903 to 1904, where they were discussing the abolition of the death penalty. And of course, this issue came up, what to do with the Tsar. Regarding that question, my view on it is international opinion. From November until April of 1917, 1918, the royal family was still, Russia was still at war with Germany. And so the Russians were thinking about favorable peace terms, and they believed that butchering the royal family before those peace terms could have negatively impacted relations and potential peace treaty. So I do think it's an eye to public opinion. And again, it's the fact that we have the combination of peace with Germany and white encroachments in the Urals, which precipitates their death. I think it makes complete sense.
Okay, no, fair enough. Yeah, no, good answer. Makes perfect sense. So I mean that was the end of that family line, and I suppose there was no. I mean, even our royal family, you could get DNA from. Prince Michael of Kent looks a bit like the Tsar, even. But yeah, I think they were all pretenders. Like the Anastasia was. I am right in thinking that was completely debunked at some point, wasn't it?
Yes, there were many. I mean, there was one claimant who I think lived in South Africa for about 90 years, always claiming to be Anastasia, but no, she it was debunked, and the remains were confirmed in the early 2000s.
Right, yeah.
So yes, if it's all right with you, History Bro, unless you have any last minute things to say, I'll just get to the super chats.
No, please do. Please go ahead.
Right, I'll just refresh this page, because now the see all button is working again. Thank you, YouTube. Narco Republican, sorry, my internet's playing up, for $2. How glorious it is to see History Bro stepping in. Indeed, we're very lucky to have you, History Bro.
No, it's an honor and a pleasure. It really is. It really is.
John Boy for €10. AM and History Bro, great to hear you together. Just as feedback, AM's audio was a bit variable for me, but enjoyed this very much. Yes, sorry, John Boy, my internet is absolutely terrible, and because of where I live and due to the quality of the internet lines, there's nothing I can do about it. I can't upgrade my internet. I can't. The only way to solve it is if I move, which is quite a radical step, I think. But thank you for that anyway. I'm sorry that the audio is rather intermittent. Hopefully, you've been able to hear most of what I've said at least. 99 Iron Duke for $5 Australian. Apostolic Majesty, I would really like you to do a stream with you and maybe History Bro on British foreign policy in 1904 to 1914. Regarding that, Iron Duke, I'm thinking, because this is really a topic where I really want to think clearly and do a lot of research on this topic, because my own sort of expertise, ironically, on British foreign policy, despite my proclivity to the Habsburgs, are actually on the post-World War I period, not the pre-World War I period. So what I'm probably going to do at some point is do a long-running series, which I've provisionally decided to call The Empire of Finance, which looks into the Glorious Revolution and British decisions all the way up until Churchill in 1945, where I really want to look at British foreign policy in this broad spectrum. But in terms of, like a smaller stream on it, sure, but be pre-warned that I probably won't be as well informed compared to the time where I actually come around and do this bigger series on my channel.
For my part, Duke, I'd be happy to. Absolutely.
And Jonathan Gordon was saying the internet was stable until a bit towards the end. Well, sorry about that. So yes, that's the end of the super chats. Unless you have anything else you want to say, History Bro, we can just sort of get to shelling your channel, I suppose.
Yeah, no, I haven't. I mean, there's a million and one things you could say about the Romanovs and Nicholas and the revolution and Rasputin, aren't there? You literally need hours, dozens of hours, really, to do it all justice. I mean, there's just so much there. So, I mean, we'll have to end at some point. But no, it's been great again, and I've genuinely learned half a dozen things here, which is great. So, well, thank you for having me on.
Wonderful. Do you want to tell us about your channel?
Oh yeah, well, just History Bro. Check it out there. I'm very, very slowly nudging towards the big 10,000 mark. So yeah, if you want to go over there, give me a sub. I'm actually in the process at the moment of making sort of shorter, more shareable clips. I've been reliably informed by those in the know that just having long form, or nearly entirely having long form, isn't the most shareable thing. So I'm making a bunch of clips at the moment, but also there are some more long form things in the pipeline. I'm researching for a few different things. I'm going to do a life of Hideki Tojo, the Razor, one of the most important people in the Pacific War. I'm going to do a thing on Arnhem, A Bridge Too Far, sort of semi-reviewing the Dickie Attenborough film, but mainly talking about the real history. And I've got another thing in the pipeline with a good friend of mine, author Dan Davis. We're going to talk about the Sharp novels, the real history behind all the various Bernard Cornwell Sharp novels. So hopefully that will go down well. And of course, I'm on Lotus Eaters, talking to Carl Benjamin every week for sort of an hour to an hour and a half. I recorded a thing earlier today about Tacitus's Germania. So yeah, check it out. Yeah, head over to my channel if you're so inclined and throw me a sub.
Absolutely wonderful. And I think the History Bro bites are a wonderful anecdote for my excessively long content over on this channel. So thank you so much, History Bro. It's been wonderful to have you on. Last minute comments. Thanks again to all my wonderful patrons who helped the work of this channel. If you have any interest in becoming a patron, do click on the link in the description. Other than that, thank you all very much for watching. Please like, share, and comment on this video. It helps so much. Thank you all for watching, and good night.
Take care. Good night.